Hi guys, so today we're here to talk about literature and we're gonna have a little chat with you. This is a video that I have talked about a long time ago actually, and I told you I was going to do it. But then I never got around doing it because I was too busy and because I didn't really know what to exactly say, because I feel like I have a lot of things to say, but then when it comes to making those into a video, it's a bit more complex. So today we're going to talk about young adult literature or young adult fiction, or YA to be a bit more concise. I want to preface this video by saying I hope no one gets offended. It is not my intention to offend or diminish or question anyone's tastes or anyone's reading habits. I'm just merely expressing my opinion and trying to have a bit of a discussion about literature, and I hope you can take this with a grain of salt, but also take this with a little bit of, lucidity, and try to be objective about it and try to see if there's anything you can take from it to perhaps, question yourself, your own habits when it comes to your reading. So as you probably know, I do not read YA. I would say probably 95% of what I read is classics, and then you have books that are not even literature or fiction, essays and books about politics and feminism and veganism. And then there is a very small part as well, which is more contemporary, but that still would fall somehow under, of course, they're not classics, but they are not your, how would I say that? It's not YA, it's not the bestsellers book. It's contemporary literature that still fits into a mold that's kind of, how to explain that, books that you could study at uni, I suppose. I don't choose my books based on are they classics or not. I don't choose my books based on are they studied at university or not. I do not choose my books based on what I should be reading, even though being a French and literature teacher and probably maybe gonna try to apply for a PhD, yes, I do have to read certain things and I do have to have some sort of literary culture and literary knowledge. So there are books that I need to read, and yes, there is a sort of to be read list for me. But coincidentally and very happily and luckily for me, this list of books that I should be reading because I'm a teacher and because I want to have this knowledge of literature, is also just the books that I would naturally read and would gravitate towards naturally. I do like classics. I like them. I like them for what they talk about, for how they talk about it. I like them for how you can study them and how deep they can be. And while I am perfectly aware that yes, classics can be problematic, and if you want me to make a video on classics, let me know. I would happily do that. I think it would be a very naive and very incorrect way to look at classics, to think of them as being written only by white males and only showing that kind of vision. So yes, I do read mostly classics because I have to, but mostly and primarily because I want to. And I have read YA when I was really young. I have read some books that, are targeted towards children or towards teenagers. But even when I was very young, I remember going to the public library with my mom, or my dad and my sister, and I remember that I would always want to go to the adult section. And very soon I started going there, and very soon I started taking books from the teenager or children or young adult section, but also the adult sections. And I remember very clearly that in the teenager section there also were classics. I remember there were Victor Hugo, Les Misérables. I remember there was some Dostoevsky. I remember there was some Jules Verne, a lot of different books. And so I have always been reading classics and another form of literature. And naturally growing up, I started giving up on YA, precisely because YA is supposed to be something you read when you're young, because it is targeted towards young people. And I I have to admit that I've never really understood why people who claim they love to read would stick to YA and not upgrade, I suppose, to books that are a bit more, that are way more complex and richer and interesting. Because yes, classics are for the most part more interesting, more complex on a literary perspective, but also just on a thought and almost on a philosophical level, way more interesting. So I have read my fair share of YA. It's been a while since I haven't read any. So a lot of you may tell me that YA that I used to read when I was younger is different from YA that's published right now, and that I'm not really in a position to say anything. But I have read extracts from really big bestsellers like John Green, for example, and I've always felt like, who honestly past a certain age, who would want to read that without getting super bored? Because it's not that it's bad, it's not that it's badly written, it's not that it's not necessarily interesting, but it is definitely something aimed for younger people. And unless you're reading it because you also read something else next to it and you really want to relax, and that's what you take to relax, unless you read it in that way, I have to admit it kind of is a mystery to me how you would not see how empty or superficial it can be. So I think what's really interesting, and when I was thinking of you doing this video, I was really trying to think of YA in history. Has YA always existed? And so it's actually interesting to notice that it hasn't, and that it actually has evolved quite a bit. So if you think of like the 18th, 19th, or even 20th or even 17th century, there was no YA as we know of as for now. And what really made me want to talk about that was also I was reading Flaubert's letters, and in those letters he talks about what he was reading when he was younger. And so he used to read things like, he used to read a lot of romanticism, a lot of British romantic literature, and then he grew out of this romantic phase that he was in to come to something that's a bit more hard to categorize. But I was like, yeah, that's interesting, because those books are considered classics, yet he was reading them as a teenager, but also those books are a very distinct genre, and they could be kind of classified as, yes, they're classics, but they are classics that are perhaps a bit more suitable for younger people. And so it's interesting to see that in history you've had classics that were perhaps not aiming at being especially written for younger people, but who naturally became kind of like those YA, even though they didn't intend to, and even though they are considered as classics now. So in, I think, British and American literatures, you could think of Lord of the Flies or The Catcher in the Rye, for example. Those books were not meant to be designed for kids or teenagers or young adults, but quickly they have become sort of staples for this sort of age group. And I think that's something interesting. And when YA just happens in that way, I do not see any problem with it, because it's something natural, sort of almost organic, that comes from an age group, that comes from a group of people who recognize themselves perhaps in some sort of literature, and it's actually beautiful, I believe. And another thing that's interesting is to see that there were a few exceptions, like books that were kind of made, yes, for children or for young adults, but who could also be enjoyed by adults. Take, for example, tales, or take fables, or in France we have this very huge, big writer who is called La Fontaine, and he used to write those little stories for the kids in the royal family, right? But you can still study them now, and there is a moral to it, and there is some sort of poetry to it, there is some sort of symbolism to it, and it really interrogates how we were writing at that time and all those things. But it's still something that kids in France read and learn at school. So it's interesting to see that there was a time where, even when it was kind of aimed at young people, it still had some sort of literary quality that made it into classics. What I think is a bit of a shame now is that it is as if you... First of all, I also want to say I really distinguish like literature for children, which is obviously, it has to be very specific, and young adult fiction, right? What I think is sad now and a bit problematic is the way that it's become a big market. It's actually really easy to get published if you want to write YA. It actually sells a lot, and it's heavily represented on social media, which is something that I think also really bothers me, is that whenever you go on YouTube, for example, on BookTube, 95% of people that are making videos about books and about literature talk about YA, and they only talk about YA, and here and there maybe a few contemporary authors, but that's it. And when you hear about classics, it's always the same classics, it's always the same English written classics, and that's it. And it's a big shame, and I think this is mainly the issue with YA that I have. It is that it is a market, and it is considered as a genre, for example, as when it's not even really a genre, because in YA you can have dystopia, you can have romance, you can have thrillers, you can have any sort of genres actually, but because it's so important economically speaking, and because it is something that's so very precisely made for an audience, I think it has become a genre, because you can open any sort of book, romance, thriller, dystopian, fantasy, whatever. If it's YA, you're gonna know it as soon as you read the first sentences. And I think that already is a bit of an issue. And the other thing that really bothers me with it is that it seems to be the only thing that people read when they read YA, and it seems to be the only thing they talk about when they make content about literatures if they read YA. And I don't think there's anything wrong with reading YA, and even if I thought, who cares, you read whatever you want, that's just my opinion, but like, I don't think there's anything wrong with reading YA as long as you can read other things, right? As soon as you only read YA, I think you're not getting... that's gonna be so... people are gonna hate me for saying that, but yes, you are not really getting introduced to literature. You're not. I'm sorry to say it like that. That's probably gonna sound super pretentious to a lot of people, but that's honestly how I feel, so I'm gonna be honest, who cares? Another thing that really bothers me is that a lot of people say that YA is important because when you're a teenager, you're not supposed to read this and that book because you're not gonna understand them fully. Yes, you're not gonna understand them fully. I remember reading Crime and Punishment. What's the title in English? Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, I think. When I was maybe 15. And of course I did not understand Dostoevsky's work properly. But still, I understood it with what I was able to understand at that age. And that's enough. And that was a challenge to read that. And challenges are what make you smarter, more intelligent, more open to new things, more open to new ways of seeing the world, to new ways of writing, to new ways of reading, to new mindsets. And that's super important. That's definitely important. So there is a very big positive effect and potential and gain that people get from reading classics, even when they're not fully equipped and armed to understand them. And it's not only a question of age, really. For me personally, there are classics that even now, if I read them and just read them, I'm not gonna get maybe even half of the book, because classics are so dense that you actually have to make the effort to get what it is about by going to class, by reading theses, by reading articles, by maybe reading notes and text by the author themselves, and maybe you need to read other books by the author to connect the two books together and then understand what it's about. But that's the beauty of literature. That's why literature is an art. You know what I mean? It's not the book that you open one afternoon and you read it so quickly. That's literature, but that's not all of literature. And I think it's sad if that's the only literature that you get. And if YA does not make you wanna read other things, I think it's doing something wrong. Because personally, when I read poetry, I then want to read poetry in prose. And then when I read prose, I'm like, oh, imagine if I could find a novel that's big and written so beautifully from start to end. And then I get to read that. And when I read that, maybe I pick up something in the novel that's super interesting, and that's perhaps something political or economical or philosophical. And then I go and jump onto an essay. And in a novel, maybe there is a reference to another author that I have never heard of. And then I'm going to read that author. And that's what's beautiful about literature, is that it's a door or a window or any sort of opening to other things. And when I see that so many people reading YA only read YA, I think, oh, something's wrong with it. I think it's almost as if you couldn't read anything else because you're so used to a certain pattern, you're so used to repetitive plots and repetitive characters and repetitive prose and styles, because style is crucial in literature, in my opinion. Another thing that kind of bothers me is that a lot of people will say that YA is interesting because it features a lot of diversity. You have queerness, you have people of color, and you have disabilities, and all those things represented in literature. That's amazing. I absolutely love that. As I said, I am not against YA. I'm just very confused, puzzled. I don't know what adjective I could use, by the way people that are over YA age still read YA and read only that. Because yes, it's amazing to have diversity, but you have diversity in classics. And the simple fact that you have this as an argument against reading classics and towards reading YA shows that you have no idea what you're talking about. There is a lot of queerness in classics. There are a lot of classics that have been written by people of color, by women, and there are a lot of classics that tackle the idea of classes, of privileges, of race, of colonialism, of heteronormativity, a lot of them actually. And what's a shame is that people that are apparently so into diversity, they refuse to give some classics that are not so well known a chance. And by doing that, you refuse those people who, in much harder times to get published and much harder times to write, risked a lot sometimes to write those books. When you are a woman and you're writing perhaps in the 19th century and you write about lesbianism, for example, or homosexuality, or when you're a man, or when you're a person of color and you try to go against the white supremacy, I think your work deserves to be read. And yes, by saying that, it's a bit of a tricky argument because you can't read everything for sure, but just turning your back on classics because they are they're not diverse enough, and because they are boring and always the same, and YA brings some novelty, I think it really shows a lack of knowledge in literature, and it's a shame. It's a shame. It's just a shame, really, to not open yourself to other kind of literatures. So yeah, I think I'm gonna stop for now because I have other things to say. Actually, I have a lot of things to say, but Yeah, I think I have developed a few points already in that video, and I'd be really interested in knowing what you guys think about that. Um, Please, as I said, do not feel offended by anything that I said. It's just my opinion, and in the end, who cares about what I think? You know, no one cares about what I think. I'm just sharing my opinion because it's interesting to discuss and because a lot of people have asked. But, you know, if I said something that, you know, you disagree with, that's fine. That's just okay. I hope that most of you can still take something from it, and I'll see you soon. Oh yes, by the way, I asked you guys on Instagram what you thought of YA, if you were reading YA and all those different things. So if you want to exchange with me on certain topics, feel free to follow me on Instagram and on Twitter. And if you want to support the channel and help me produce more videos and still, you know, have a lot of content out there, you can support me with $1 a month on Patreon, and it actually really helps. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you're doing amazingly well, and I'll see you soon. Bye!